team. Welcome to our next, really, this is a bridge between our study of culture and our study of political geography. My apologies for my voice. I'm coming down sick, so bear with me through this video. So we're going to start first with 4.1, looking at how ethnicity, race, and gender influence identity. So this is a bit of an extension on our study specifically of cultural patterns and cultural components. We're going to expand that into 3 different threads that are going to return throughout the course of the year. So we've already established this at length, that culture shapes identity. Culture shapes who we are, it shapes the way we think, it shapes what we do, it shapes what we believe, it really shapes our outlook on life. And that there are 3 ways that our self-identity is either crafted, meaning we make it, or it's prescribed to us, that are in addition to culture. So we could put culture under this bullet point as well here. But our gender, our ethnicity, and our race craft either the way we see ourselves or what we are told. And those are both positive and, sadly, more often than not, negative in terms of what we're being told, what we can do. It shapes what people, those 3 components, our gender, our ethnicity, and our race across the global space, can contribute to what we can do, what we cannot do, the jobs that people are allowed to have, access to housing, things you can add on to there. Actually, we'll do that right now together. We could talk about the education level that you're given access to. We can talk about your, generally speaking, just your access to opportunity in life. And when I'm saying we, I'm saying this in broad strokes terms. I'm referring just across the board, those 3 concepts of gender, ethnicity, and race, for better and, sadly, again, more often than not worse, are often told to us how they shape our cultural identity and our self-identity. We're going to start first with how gender crafts individual identity. There is, sadly, a gender gap that persists across the world. The gender gap is the term that refers to the persistent, meaning ongoing, inequities. Inequities mean inequalities and, more specifically, unfairnesses between men and women. That despite the fact that I am your teacher, I have the privilege of being your teacher and having a job outside the home, and having a significant amount of choice in my life, that is not necessarily the case for many women across the world. In fact, very traditional gender expectations really persist across much of the world. That term patriarchal, if you're not familiar with that from your studies of history, patriarchal mean societies where men are either more valued or have more power than women. There's income inequality, where men typically make more money than women, and something we're going to return to in just a second. And there's also underrepresentation in politics, where societies, and you certainly see this here in the United States, continuing, is that despite many advancements in women's rights and women's opportunities, politically, their society is still strongly influenced and represented by men. You can see in the map here, that's a bit out of date, from 2005, you can see female income as a percentage of male income, meaning that if for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes but a certain percentage of that. Now let's clarify what that means, because that's a commonly cited statistic. That doesn't mean that necessarily, though this certainly happens, that men and women are hired for the exact same job and men are paid more than women. Let me be clear, that happens. What that statistic more commonly refers to is the idea that if you're comparing the salaries between men and women of comparable jobs, men tend to make more money. And then that can be a factor, can be a component of the fact that women often take, for example, maternity leave, which means that they are then, in turn, both deliberately and unintentionally passed around for, say, promotions that would give them more money, or more leadership roles. But on the whole, what matters here is that gender crafts our identity, and that there are consistent and persistent inequities between men and women on a global scale, and the access to those opportunities is very different across the genders. There's ways we measure this, and one way that, something we'll come back to actually when we study development, we study the Gender Inequality Index. And the Gender Inequality Index measures reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market participation. Those are the 3 things that the measurement, the 3 indicators it uses. You can label those if you see fit as 1, 2, and 3. And it's measured from 0 to 1. So if there's 0, that means there's no inequality. It's kind of backwards. 0 means there's no inequality. 1 means there's high inequality between men and women. If you're measuring reproductive health, it's measuring maternal mortality rate, so how many women are dying as a result of giving birth. which is usually an indication access to medicine and the development of the country, in addition to just the access of care that women have, both prenatal and postnatal care. Adolescent fertility rates, so the percentage of young mothers that are giving that are in a country. It's also an indication, generally speaking, of the economic opportunities available to women, the educational opportunities available to women, and to some extent the cultural expectations of women, to see whether or not women are expected in this culture and in this place to simply give birth, or if they're working outside of the home. Measures empowerment. Empowerment is measured by the higher education levels of women. So how many women are receiving college degrees and even more advanced degrees, such as doctorates and JDs for law and things like that. And the number of seats held by women in national politics. So you can see again that this is a leadership level of women. Are women actually in positions of power in this given place? The labor market reference is measuring the percentage of women who are in the workforce. And these three measures help us understand. I gave a picture here of a woman, a young woman who's very famous for advocating for greater gender equality. That's Malala, who was advocating for education for young women, and when she was targeted by the Taliban, she fortunately survived that attack. But her story is a key reminder that, I mean, she's not much older than you all, if not your age, or younger for some of you. It was a key reminder that that opportunities for women is not something to be taken for granted, and that there are many places around the world where there is significant inequality. Another thing we're going to take a look at is ethnicity. So our common frame here again is how these three concepts shape our cultural identity. Our gender shapes our cultural identity, both the expectations and the opportunities in many places available to people. And this concept of ethnicity is an important one, because ethnicity is a very confusing term that's often blurred together with race, and it's also misused in many different contexts. So we're going to start off because ethnicity really captures a lot of what we've studied all throughout the course, this unit here with culture. So I'm going to give you the specific definition, and then we're going to differentiate what that means between this and race. Ethnicity is identity with a group of people that share a distinctive physical and mental traits as a product of common heredity and cultural traditions. Now I took that directly from the book, because this is the Rubenstein book, because these are some confusing concepts, and I want to get one solid definition and then talk about why this could potentially be a bad definition. Ethnicity, for all intents and purposes, is going to mean that a cultural identity, a culture that can be a result, as it says there, of mental traits. Perhaps that's mentally agreeing upon your faith. That could be way of living. That could be gender roles. That could be the way a society should function. That could be the language that should be spoken. That could be your sense of nationality in your country, these things that bind you. Physically, this is where it starts to get a little complicated, because ethnicity is usually based upon the idea that a group of people have a common culture. So think of all the things we've been studying: language, religion, pop and folk culture. Think of all of the different cultural components coming together and are shared by a common group of people. It's most likely that those group of people are going to be occupying a similar space, but not necessarily have to be, but a similar space and have a similar heritage. When people have a common heritage, then they're going to have some common physical characteristics over time. That does not mean that people have to look a specific way, however, to be a component of a certain ethnicity, but that usually is a component of ethnicity, is a certain cultural and physical characteristics that bind a group of people. In a very simplistic sense, ethnicity is cultural identity. Right? So this transcends language, transcends religion, transcends pop and folk culture. Ethnicity is the common cultural identity. Now, just for a second, I'm going to differentiate that between race. Okay. Now, race is constantly, these terms are constantly mixed up and constantly misused between race and ethnicity. Again, ethnicity is that common cultural identity, whereas race, and I'm taking this directly from the book, is a categorization of humans based upon skin color and other physical characteristics. So you see right from the get-go, there's no culture associated here. Race is a physical identifying characteristic. And another alternative definition that a different book uses, excuse me, is identity with a group of people descended from a common ancestor. If you're coming from a common ancestor, as I just discussed there, you're going to have common physical characteristics. Now, what I am including in my discussion here, just simply as educated people, is that race is a social construct. What I mean by that is it's socially invented. What defines one race of people versus another is not scientific or defined. Over periods of time in the history of the world, in the history of the United States, people have tried to use science to say that there are different races of human beings. Like, for example, it was the Caucasoid versus the Negroid. What was it? Negrozoid? Negroid? I think that's what it was called. Absolutely bogus nonsense. Humans are humans. We're biologically unified as a human race, as Homo sapiens sapiens. That's it. Race, however, is this term that people use to identify skin color, different characteristics of really. I mean, skin color is really what it comes down to. But look at this U.S. Census. You can see right from the get-go that they don't even use this term properly. Asian Indian, if you see it the right there, on the U.S. Census that takes the population characteristics, that has nothing to do with race, right? That's an ethnicity. That you see Chinese, that's an ethnicity. That's not a race. Really, these terms of race and ethnicity are so convoluted and mixed up. What we are going to focus on is we are going to focus on ethnicity, which is the cultural identity of a group of people and the group of people who too have common physical characteristics. So almost as if race is a subset of this ethnicity. Again, I fully understand how confusing that is because these terms are just constantly misused and confused and poorly defined by our society. But let's stick with ethnicity as your cultural identity. And as a geographer, we're going to be looking at the fact that people are often physically together, physically move together and live together and exist along ethnic lines. That's not a problem when it's voluntary, right? Because it gives people a sense of belonging if you're choosing to live together. We talked about this already when we talked about ethnic neighborhoods and chain migration. That you and I, if we move to a new place, we'd probably want to find people that speak English. That's the language that we express ourselves in, or perhaps wherever language you express yourself best in. And that's an example of living together in a voluntary setting. So you can see over there, excuse me again, Chicago's ethnic neighborhoods. You can see is primarily based upon different ethnic groups of people. Irish Catholics, Puerto Rican, German, Chinese, Italian. Now, these are not necessarily bad, except for the fact that these are not coincidental. More specifically, most of the ethnic neighborhoods that exist and ethnic patterns of living that are present in the United States, for example, are forced. Right? They're forced ethnic segregation, really, and forcing different ethnic groups to live together. What I mean more specifically, ghettos are this term is also totally misused in modern society. Ghettos are started actually in Europe, and there were specific spaces that are set aside for a particular ethnic group. And a ghetto is not a choice, right? A ghetto is not a representation of a poor area, for example. That's a misuse of the term. A ghetto is a forced segregation of a group of people, and that's that particular. I'm sorry, a little out of it here. Ethnic group. A ghetto is not voluntary. It's not somewhere, and then often as a result of this segregation, the area is deprived of resources. So that's the formal use of the term, and that in turn helps us explain some of the inequities and inequalities that persist in modern day in the United States. Um, something we'll pick up just a second when we're looking at the ethnic distribution in the United States and studying the distribution of African Americans, which was entirely forced in this country, and historically speaking. The modern trend, when I'm referring to where people live based upon ethnic lines, ethnicity used to be geographically tied. So again, as I mentioned before, ethnic groups tended to live together and to exist together in different places of the world. But because of modern globalization and modern technology and modern economies, ethnicities are now widely distributed across the world, which is why that physical characteristic of ethnicity is not necessarily as closely tied to the ethnicity anymore. There's now far greater ethnic diversity in our world because of the interactions of groups of people. So historically, it was really easy to trace people based on ethnicity and specifically based on their physical look because people were more isolated. But now in modern days, and people interact, physical characteristics aren't necessarily the defining characteristic of an ethnicity. Here's an example of the, Washington, D.C.'s ethnic map, and you can already see some of the convoluted terms here between race and ethnicity, but this comes, uh, excuse me, from the Washington Post. You can see the ethnic distribution. The red dots represent the white population of D.C., the surrounding region. Blue is the black population, orange is the Hispanic population, and green is the Asian population. Right off the bat, you see that convoluted term between white, which is really just a description of race, versus ethnicity, and black versus that's a race versus an ethnicity. There's so much diversity within both of those terms. But you can see just from to drive home my point about people living um, based on ethnic terms, in this case, often racial terms. And this is a product of both voluntary and forced policies over the history of the United States. In opposite scenarios, where people tend to live, as I mentioned already, in the modern day, people are living in so many places and ethnicities are so blended with one another. But in modern day, people are living, there are still places where people are living really, really closely aligned to their ethnic identity. For example, in Eastern Europe, the national borders, this is something we'll return to in two flip videos, essentially, national, meaning the country borders are essentially constructed to make sure that certain ethnic groups live with one another. The key example of that is in Yugoslavia, that Yugoslavia no longer exists, and it broke up into all kinds of multiple different countries that were specifically designed to make sure that this group, such as the Serbians, lived in Serbia versus the Albanians living in Albania. So there are places of the world where ethnicity is still strongly aligned to the country. That, of course, again, look back at the United States is not the case. Another example is in the Basque region of Spain and Catalonia in Spain. Both of those places want their own countries. That's called wanting sovereignty so that they can rule over their own ethnic groups. So two examples of, despite the fact that we've got this massive globalization of ethnic identity and ethnic groups are merging and interacting with other ones, there's still places where ethnic identity is very strong and people want to maintain their individuality in that sense. I already went through this, but just in case you didn't get that down, you can pause here to differentiate between race and ethnic identity. Both ethnicity and race, sadly, are used historically and in modern day as tools of oppression. Key example of that you're most familiar with is segregation in the United States. So this idea that of races being legally separated in public facilities, which we'll come back to in just a second. You see that with apartheid. Apartheid was the same system. You can see the examples of this in the pictures in South Africa, where there was legalized segregation between the whites, who are known as Afrikaans, and the population of South Africa that existed far before whites arrived there, which was the black population. So there's this legalized segregation until 1994, and when Nelson Mandela, a name you're probably familiar with, was elected president, and he was able to end this racist policy. There's also even prejudice of colorism, which is the prejudice of against dark-skinned people, or valuing the physical characteristics of light-skinned people. That's something that persists across the world. You can see that when you look no further than a magazine rack here in the United States and see the conceptions of beauty and what is portrayed as beautiful, and that's certainly an example of colorism and this preference of certain physical characteristics of another, something I hope you seek to combat in your own lives. Ethnicity, sadly, in an extreme sense, ethnicity can lead to, this is an extreme scenario, to the idea of ethnocentrism, which is the belief that one's ethnicity, sometimes this can be related to race, but is not exclusively related to race, is superior to others, and acting upon that belief. I'm sorry, that's a typo there. I don't need to say insuperior. An example of that would be the crisis in the Balkans. The Balkan region is the one I mentioned already of Yugoslavia. We're here take a peek at this map so you can get yourself oriented. Here's Europe. Let me see if I can change this. There you go. You can see this is Italy. So we're here in this Balkan. This is known as the Balkans, the Adriatic Sea. There's Italy. In this, really, it's sort of a transition point between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but we really consider this to be Eastern Europe. There was a very, very complicated situation that emerged in the 1990s, where in this, what was one country known as Yugoslavia, the Serbians, which was one of the ethnic groups that, as you can see, was in Serbia, in the Serbian region, they had very ethnocentric beliefs about their superiority and their right to to control this land. And this led to some pretty horrific ethnic cleansing, which is when a group of people is forced out or killed by another group. And the dissolution, that means the falling apart of this entire country of Yugoslavia. So you can see the whole country broke apart into ethnic lines. That's really an extreme example of ethnocentrism. As I mentioned, that term of ethnic cleansing, again, sometimes ethnicity can be so deeply ingrained in a group of people that they believe in the superiority of that ethnicity, despite the fact that it really might not necessarily be very unique to them. And you've got ethnic cleansing is when one ethnic group tries to systematically kill or forcibly move a group of people. And then another example of this would be in modern day would be in Rwanda in 1994, really for the years preceding and thereafter. We had a Hutu majority, which is the Hutus were the majority ethnicity, tried to systematically kill, and very successfully did so, the Tutsi minority. And you can see one of the major problems with the Rwanda crisis, and something we'll come back to, is that Rwanda was a landlocked country, and that had meaning that it's completely surrounded by land. You can see here, Lake Victoria, lakes don't count, so this is going to be the no access to seas. That really contributed to this problem. It was a really horrific situation where Hutus were systematically killing Tutsis based on this concept of ethnicity, but the differences between the two were so just insane and mundane and really asinine, for no lack of a better term. And the Tutsis, these ethnic identities had actually been forced upon them by the Belgians who had colonized there. And just a little quote from the National Geographic helps understand just how ridiculous this was. Tutsis are tall and thin, you read that somewhere, except when they aren't. Hutus have broad noses, someone told you that, except when they have narrow noses. The real giveaway, however, is that traditionally Tutsis are herders and Hutus are farmers, except for the Tutsis who grow crops and the Hutus who keep cattle. And then there are ones that live in the city and do neither. In fact, they speak the same language, Kinyarwanda, and eat the same food and go to the same schools and root for the same football teams, and in many cases marry and raise children together. So this horrific, horrific genocide that killed just thousands and thousands and thousands of people was an example of truly extreme ethnocentrism, and the idea that the ethnicity is more superior than to another. So, a lot of information there. We covered a lot of ground. I really want to focus in on those the concepts of race and ethnicity, but gender too is an important component of cultural identity. There are the 3 analysis questions. Thank you for bearing with me through this cold, and I will see you guys in class.